Have you ever taken such a meeting?
Why did you leave it? Why?
They're still wrong. Can you explain to me why?
I'm asking.
Explain this.
The Fifth Estate. Tonight, it was the most shocking atrocity story about Iraq's invasion of Kuwait.
They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
But was it true?
2 weeks after the liberation, it became apparent that the story was a complete hoax.
Lyndon McIntyre exposes the big lie of the Gulf crisis and the massive public relations campaign that whipped up war fever in the United States.
Good evening, I'm Lyndon McIntyre. A year ago tonight, the United States was just a week away from launching a massive military assault on Iraq. It was to be the culmination of a 5-month-long political effort to liberate Kuwait from the iron grip of Saddam Hussein's invasion and occupation. Americans supported the move to war, outraged in no small part by reports of atrocities by Iraqi troops in Kuwait. The Fifth Estate has investigated the most notorious atrocity story, that Saddam's soldiers ripped babies from incubators and left them to die. The identity of a key witness to that story provides a disturbing insight into a multi-million-dollar propaganda campaign to sell a war. The morning of January 17th came early to Baghdad.
The liberation of Kuwait has begun.
Getting ready to go wherever they tell us to go.
There were troops and hardware from 32 countries, but Americans led the way, finally ending a debate about whether or not economic sanctions would be enough to drive Saddam back to Iraq.
Everybody supports the armed forces there, and 80–90% probably support what President Bush has done.
The previous August, Saddam's army virtually destroyed the economy of his rich but tiny neighbor. His soldiers looted and burned as they rolled through Kuwait almost unopposed. But Americans were unmoved and unwilling to take on another faraway war against battle-hardened fanatics.
Very few Americans knew what Kuwait was when the invasion took place, and the odds are they didn't care much that Iraq had invaded Kuwait. They probably couldn't even find it on a map. For the most part, Americans are famously ignorant of geography. So this war very much had to be sold to the American people in order to convince them to intervene militarily.
The selling job started early enough and honestly, as terrified Kuwaitis fled into neighboring Saudi Arabia. There were scores of personal accounts of suffering, but one story in particular confirmed the callous brutality of the invaders.
They stole the incubators and threw the babies out of the incubators.
22 newborn babies were in incubators at Adan Hospital, and the troops, the Iraqi troops, turned off the oxygen of those incubators.
The story was reported and repeated, and even without confirming evidence became part of the case for a war in response to Saddam's aggression. Then in Washington, before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, co-chairman John Porter of Illinois and Thomas Lantis of California presented the first eyewitness to the incubator report. She was a 15-year-old schoolgirl, and her story shocked an audience that extended far beyond the hearing room.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
Her story put a pitiful human face on testimony from the Kuwaiti ambassador who spoke to the Human Rights Caucus earlier that day, Nasir al-Sabah.
The Human Rights Caucus, led by Congressman Lantis and Congressman Porter, were very instrumental on this. They were deeply touched by what they heard. They were deeply touched when everyone, I think, in the country was deeply touched to what they saw and heard from those hearings.
U.S. Congress held a highly emotional hearing today on atrocities in Kuwait.
Newscasts crackled with the story.
Infants taken from their mothers, and a 15-year-old girl afraid to use her real name in case of reprisals against her family in Kuwait.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers.
The first time, I think, when the American people were focused on what was happening to the Kuwaiti citizens at the hands of the Iraqi soldiers.
Human Rights Caucus co-chairman John Porter, who is a Republican, had some quick feedback from one important member of the audience.
I got feedback from the president. I happened to be over at the White House the afternoon, later in the evening, after the afternoon of the hearings, and the president said that he had seen it on CNN, and that he was shocked at some of the things that he had heard.
They had people on
the president repeated the incubator story 6 times in his verbal war against Saddam.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
Daylight brings only the digging of yet more graves as bodies...
Soon there were reports of mass burials of premature babies in Kuwait, dumped from incubators which were then trucked to Baghdad.
The Iraqis tore the respirators from their incubators.
We had to bury many of people...
And the story didn't just have an impact in the U.S. The United Nations convened a rare public forum.
The hardest thing was burying the babies. I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators by the soldiers.
Will those in favor...
In a vote 2 days later, the UN approved the use of force against Iraq. Within days of the UN session, a report on Kuwait by Amnesty International quoted Naira's testimony to the U.S. congressman, and they put a number on the infant deaths, 312. Meanwhile, the U.S. Congress was preparing to authorize military force.
Teach us that now is the time to check the aggression of this ruthless dictator whose troops have bayoneted pregnant women and have ripped babies from their incubators in Kuwait.
The House easily approved a war resolution. Then it was up to the Senate.
To authorize the use of United States armed forces pursuant to United
In the debate, the incubator story came up 7 times.
Mr. Dole, aye. Mr. Domenici, aye.
In the end, the war resolution only passed by 5 votes. The U.S. decision to wage war against Iraq was supported by an overwhelming civilian consensus. The heart of that consensus was the belief that Saddam Hussein was evil incarnate, and there was no shortage of evidence for that belief. The savagery of his attack on Kuwait was consistent with his behavior at home. There should have been no need for invented atrocity stories, but as evidence from independent investigators now shows, that's exactly what the U.S. people and the whole world got. Dr. David Chu is a biomedical engineer at British Columbia Institute of Technology. He was assigned by the World Health Organization to go to Kuwait last May to assess the damage to medical equipment. He visited all facilities from operating rooms to maternity wards, expecting a lot more damage than he found.
I felt I was lied to. I was quite surprised to see a large number of infant incubators there. So I asked the person who was guiding us what happened, whether the story we were told was true or not. They said the taking of incubators away had not occurred.
Dr. Ian Pollock took pictures too, investigating the incubator story for London-based Physicians for Human Rights. The suggestion 312 babies died when incubators were stolen was wrong.
I don't think there were anything like that number of babies who would have been in incubators and dependent on them. The number is far too great. In one situation, I found a paediatrician who was willing to tell me off the record that he knew of this story. He also felt it was not true, but also felt that it was being spread by some people for their own reasons as, if you like, misinformation.
A lot of people have said that this was part of a disinformation program.
Though Amnesty International first reported the 312 figure, they soon retreated from the early details and now deny the entire incubator story. Spokesman Sean Stiles in London.
We spoke to well over a dozen doctors of different nationalities who had been in Kuwait at the time, and they couldn't stand the story up, and it became quite clear to us that credible medical opinion was that this didn't happen.
Officials of Middle East Watch, which also monitors human rights, were suspicious from the start. Executive Director Andrew Whitley of New York was part of a two-man investigation in Kuwait, and he doesn't mince words describing the incubator story.
Soon after we arrived in Kuwait, 2 weeks after the liberation, it became apparent that the story was a complete hoax. We were able to go round the hospitals to count the incubators and find that, possibly with one or two that had been misplaced, that none were missing. So none of the incubators were moved in the first place. Moreover, it seemed quite clear that there weren't any deaths which had been deliberately the cause of the Iraqis having gone in and stolen equipment.
So how did a story that was essentially untrue become an element in a consensus that sent hundreds of thousands of American and Allied troops into a regional conflict that might have been settled by other means? Well, the answer to that question lies in a process that's as American as Pepsi Cola.
It's about your scholarship, you heard? We were looking for a little better outside shooter. You're the Pepsi generation. But Hamilton.
Anybody who thinks advertising is a hit-or-miss business has been asleep for 40 years. What you're looking at is a device for measuring the impact of an ad on a target audience. The monitor records the sensory impact of the images, and if it sells Pepsi, it'll also sell a president and his message.
This morning I'm also grateful to have this.
The company that monitored Pepsi ads also monitored the effectiveness of key players in the war of words that led up to the shooting war in the Gulf last year.
What's happening is the
Dee Alsop of the Worthland Group in Washington picks response groups to rate sales pitches.
We give them each a little device. It's about the size of their hand in which they can say whether or not they're reacting favorably or unfavorably to what's being said. And across the screen is a line that goes up and down depending on whether Americans are agreeing with what the president's saying or disagreeing.